starved of sex, making it inevitable they will end up paying for it. Not surprisingly, the new report has sparked some controversy. Its author, Dr. Catherine Hakim, who's a sociologist at London School of Economics, joins me now to talk about this, along with Jan McLeod from the Women's Support Project, who backs a different approach. And escort Laura Lee is with me here in the studio to give us her experience from the front line of the sex business. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining me this morning. Catherine, can I just start with you first as the author of this report? Why exactly do you think it's time for decriminalisation?
Well, we have to remember that selling sexual services is perfectly legal in Britain and in most European countries. Decriminalisation is really about making it legally okay for third parties to provide them with services such as rent them a flat, but also to allow girls to work together in one flat, which otherwise would be classified as a brothel, and therefore leave them open to prosecution. There have been cases of boyfriends and even the children of prostitutes being prosecuted for pimping just because they live with a woman who sells sexual services. So it's much more complicated than saying it's illegal now. It isn't illegal now, but a lot of the industry is effectively criminalised. And I'm in good company. The United Nations has already promoted the idea that we should decriminalise the sex industry across the whole world. And of course, Amnesty International is now also recommending that it should be decriminalised.
But why now?
My reason is that I've looked at the results of the sex surveys carried out around Europe and the rest of the world in the last 2 decades. And these show that there is a large, substantively important gap between men and women in their sexual interest, sexual motivation, sexual desire. And this occurs within marriages as well as outside marriages. And this means that the feminist idea that men and women were exactly the same sexually is simply a myth. And we have to address the fact that there is this, if you like, extra additional surplus of sexuality or sexual interest amongst men, or what I call the male sex deficit. And therefore, the sex industry, the sale of sexual entertainments and services is going to be ineradicable, and we should address that. And one way of dealing with it is to decriminalise prostitution.
And you think feminism is directly responsible for this gap, this deficit, because of changes that it's caused in society and more women going out to work, etc.?
No. What I say is the gap has always been there. Now we know from sex surveys, we've got solid evidence that it is there and is still there now after the sexual revolution, after the contraceptive revolution made recreational sex, premarital sex easy. And it's not eliminated, as feminists said it would be. It's still there. And in addition, I say there are several reasons why I think it's going to grow over time. There's already indications from some surveys, for example, in Finland, that it is growing steadily. And so the idea that it will be eliminated is wrong, and I'm predicting growth.
Let me bring in at this stage Jan McLeod from the Women's Support Project. Jan, what do you think of this?
Well, to be honest, I disagree with so many aspects of it that it's hard to know where to start. I don't believe that the problem is a huge gap in the level of sexual desire between men and women, but rather a sense of entitlement from men, which has currently been driven by increased access to pornography. And I don't mean erotica, I mean violent pornography, really, that is often very misogynistic and depicts the sort of sex that most women are not in the least bit interested in their day-to-day sex life. I think women have better protection now against sexual violence. For example, there's been the criminalisation of rape and marriage and the implementation of laws against sexual harassment at work. Now, clearly that's protection against unwanted sexual activity. And I don't think that equates with women having less interest in sex in general. I think what we're seeing here is a situation where some men are thinking, well, it's no longer acceptable for me to behave like that within my domestic situation or with my girlfriend. So what's the point of bringing in these laws? if we can then say to men, that's okay, you can go and buy those sorts of sexual activities that women don't like or want, and we'll have a class of women in prostitution that have less rights than other women.
Let me just put that back to Catherine Hakim. So the internet is more responsible for this than the changes in society around feminism that you've been talking about.
No, she's saying this is a completely distorted argument. The idea that the vast majority of people in the sex industry are providing violent kinds of sex is complete nonsense. The most common and the most popular and the most expensive service is the girlfriend experience, which is a normal date, exactly like a date with anyone else that you might have, but the only difference is that you include sex at the end of the evening, after dinner or after drinks.
It's not a normal date if one person is being paid to consent to
that. It is not violence. It is normal. It is normal social interaction, a dinner date, a date for drinks, and then you have sex as well. There's nothing violent about this. There is this stereotype of the sex industry as being completely transgressive, about violence, about underage sex, about trafficking, and all these negative things are out-of-date stereotypes that just simply are factually untrue in the modern age.
Let's find out from somebody who knows better than any of the three of us. Escort Laura Lee is with me here in the studio. What's your perspective on this, Laura? Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. I'm with Dr. Hakim about 95% of the way. I absolutely believe that the sex industry should be decriminalised, but for completely different reasons. The sex industry, my job, is the only job in the UK which compels me as a woman to work on my own. And it sends out a message to would-be attackers that we're vulnerable, that we're on our own, we're very possibly carrying cash, and that we're most unlikely to go forward to report attacks to the police. So I'm coming at it from a different aspect, and that's from our safety. And absolutely it should be decriminalised to allow us to work together to keep an eye on each other.
And how would it work differently? Talk us through how you think decriminalisation would make it safer for you.
Well, I think we need to step back from the stereotype of all singing, all dancing, Nevada-style brothels. What we're talking about here is two women working together in a flat for safety. And as things stand at the moment, the police can arrest both of those women. Whilst deeming them vulnerable victims, they can arrest both of them from pimping from each other and take the money that they seize during that raid away from them as well. Now, if that's how we look after vulnerable victims, then I'm at a loss.
Do you recognise this sexual deficit that Dr. Hakim was talking about here between the desires of men and women, which results in increased trade for the sex trade?
I don't see a big difference in years gone by and nowadays between the desires or the volume of appointments coming through from men, to be honest. I don't think there's a deficit as such. The sex industry will always be there. It's always been there to serve a purpose, and it will always be there as well. And for me, it's about how we keep the most vulnerable within that industry at their safest.
And what about the point that Jan McLeod was making about the experience being driven now by the internet?
I don't believe that for a minute either. I don't think pornography has anything to do with it. Pornography has always been there as well. I've certainly not noticed an upswing in a request for anything approaching violence. If anything, the shoe is on the other foot for me. OK, Jan McLeod, back to you from Women's Support Project. What would you like to say?
Well, I think we're coming from very different places. I work for a voluntary organisation that works in partnership with services such as homelessness services, addiction and mental health services across Scotland. And overwhelmingly what you hear from those services is that people do not enter prostitution when they've got a range of other choices in front of them. And the profile of women and men who are involved in street prostitution across Scotland is disadvantage, poverty, and very often previous experience of abuse. And I think if we decriminalise without any safeguards, then these people are going to be further exploited. And if I could just make it very, very clear, we fully support removing all criminalisation of people who are selling sex. The majority of people, not everybody, but the majority of people in prostitution, as I said, are previously disadvantaged. And it is ridiculous to say that's a form of exploitation, but we'll continue to criminalise you. So I agree very much with that, but at the same time, we want safeguards that will prevent vulnerable people being forced by poverty or other factors, or coerced by abusive partners, for example, into prostitution.
And how could you safeguard against that?
I think the main thing is to try and reduce the driving force behind prostitution, which poverty is the main reason that women go into prostitution, but the driving force behind it is the fact that there's a market there. Almost anybody can quite quickly make money in prostitution, but that experience very often leads to other problems. So what I'm talking about is criminalising the demand and sending out the message to men that it's not acceptable to buy sex off somebody that's less well off than you, that's vulnerable, and as I say, has previously been disadvantaged.
But we know that the end demand approach in Sweden just simply hasn't worked. Recently, a report said that the number of sex buyers had not decreased at all. The number of sex workers had not decreased at all. And violence against sex workers is at an all-time high, as is abuses by the police force. So that doesn't work.
Well, I would also like to. Prosecutors
and
the police say. I have to say that there's different views, but I think that if you were to speak to the people that are dealing with the recorded statistics in Sweden, you would see that law has made a difference and it's reduced.
Let me just bring Dr. Catherine Hakim back in, whose report sparked this discussion this morning. Catherine.
Yes. First of all, she's right. The change of law in Sweden has made no difference. Secondly, all the sex surveys carried out in Sweden show that 4 out of 5 men, Swedish men, who buy sexual services do so outside Sweden, in the Far East or in other European countries or in neighbouring countries. Criminalising clients only pushes the demand to other countries. It doesn't change things, it pushes it abroad. And in Britain also, 2/3 of all the men who buy sexual services do it outside Britain, despite the fact that it's perfectly legal to buy sex in Britain. So pushing it to another country, to countries where people are even poorer and even more vulnerable, is not particularly admirable in any way at all.
But Catherine, wouldn't a good first step be, as Jan was saying, to put out the message a bit more clearly perhaps, that paying for sex from women who are in a vulnerable position and are only there perhaps because of poverty is not a good thing to be doing in the first place?
Yes, well, let's look at the survey data on women and men, because everybody forgets that men sell sexual services as well, mainly to men. The survey evidence is that, particularly for call girls and so on, working through the internet very often, half of them have university degrees. 1 in 5 has a postgraduate degree. These are not stupid, ignorant and vulnerable people, as you put it. They're people who have other options, who have the ability to earn a living in professional jobs if they want to, but it's so lucrative to sell sexual services when you're young and very attractive that a lot of people do it, usually on a part-time basis. And this has become a trend throughout Europe. It's not just Britain. Throughout Europe, you find students, graduate people are working in this industry for a short time, usually 2-3 years, not much longer than that, when they're very young and very attractive and have very high earnings.
Well, again, we're looking from the outside. Laura Lee is in this business. Do you recognise that description that you're hearing there from Catherine, Laura?
Absolutely, and it's one I come across again and again. And I think what we need to remember is that actually the street sex trade represents just under about 12% of the overall trade. So while you do come across some very vulnerable women that do require protection, that's a very small minority. The vast majority are working indoors of their own volition.
Why do you choose to do it?
I've done it for a very long time. It's something that's always called me back, and the work I do now is really quite diverse. And it suits I'm working on my second degree, and I have a PhD coming up as well, so it suits my lifestyle. I can fund my studies.
Jan McLeod, final word on this to you.
Just in relation to the women who've come out of university and gone into prostitution, based on the women who've called us, and just to say we don't have funding for a support service, but people call us because they see information on our website. And very often the gist of it is, I went into escorting because I thought it would help me pay off my student loans. I did it for 6 months. It was absolutely horrific, and I feel it's ruined my life. I want you to warn other women. Now, that might not happen to everybody, but we now say to young women who phone us up and say, I'm thinking of going into escorting, that yes, it might bring short-term rewards, but it's very likely to bring you long-term grief. And I think overall my message would be that the sex industry is harmful for women, it's harmful very often for families, and it's something that we shouldn't be tolerating in a society that's striving for gender equality.
Jan,
Well,
thanks for
Belle
that.
de Jour, who lives in Scotland, would take a very different view.
I'm sure she would, but that does not weigh against the many, many hundreds of women who come forward to services in Scotland and say, this is causing me pain and grief.
Jan and Catherine, thank you. I just want to bring in a text that's just come in this moment. Escort services and the girlfriend experience are not representative of the main type of sexual activity that takes place within prostitution. The majority of people involved in prostitution don't deliver those services. The escort you've got on your programme is not representative of the vast majority of people working in the business. 75% of people involved become involved before the age of 14. The majority working in the business have been raped at work, and 90% would like to exit now but don't know how. Laura?
Oh dear. The 75% statistic comes from Melissa Farley that has been debunked so many times it's laughable. The 90% that would like to exit, that was a poll of women who were already part of an exit programme. So that's biased sampling, I'm afraid. And as for the final point that I'm not representative, I'm afraid that's not true. I've been in the industry for 22 years and I've worked at every single tier within the industry. So I have stood on street corners at 2 o'clock in the morning on a December, absolutely freezing to death. So the not representative thing doesn't fly, I'm afraid.
And no plans to stop right now?
No, because I'm quite content with my work right now.
OK, Laura, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. We're coming up to 10:25 on BBC Radio Scotland. We're back talking on Dress Down Friday, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable to wear in the office after this.